The forest was supposed to be empty. No trails, no markers, just miles of dense trees and overgrown brush. I'd come here for the thrill, searching for an old military bunker rumored to be buried somewhere deep in the woods. But I hadn't found the bunker. What I found was something much worse. After hours of trekking, I stumbled across a small, weathered cabin hidden far off the beaten path. It was old, barely standing, with rotting wood and a roof that sagged like it was ready to collapse. At first glance, it seemed abandoned, but something about it felt wrong, out of place. My gut twisted the moment I saw it. I moved closer, cautious, the hair on the back of my neck standing up. There was no sound except for the wind in the trees and the crunch of dead leaves beneath my boots. But then, just as I was about to turn away, I heard it, a faint sob. At first, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me, but there it was again, a soft, desperate cry coming from inside the cabin. Curiosity turned to dread as I edged around the side of the building, keeping out of sight. My heart pounded as I reached a cracked window, its glass yellowed and splintered. Slowly, I peeked inside. That's when I saw her. A woman, bound and gagged, tied to a chair in the corner of the dim room. Her clothes were torn, her face pale, and her eyes were wide with terror, locked on something or someone moving in the shadows. My breath caught in my throat as I saw him, a large man pacing across the room, unaware of my presence. His movements were slow, methodical, like he had all the time in the world. I took a step back, my mind racing. The woman's muffled sobs echoed in my ears, her fear palpable even from where I stood. She needed help now. But I was miles from the nearest road, let alone a town, and my phone had no signal. No one was coming. It was just me. I looked around, trying to think, trying to breathe. I could leave, try to find help, but that could take hours. Or I could stay, try to rescue her myself. One wrong move, and I'd be the next one tied up inside that cabin. But if I didn't act, she was as good as dead. My pulse quickened as I weighed my options, my stomach knotting tighter with each passing second. I didn't have a plan yet, but I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't just walk away, not now. I crouched behind the cabin, my mind a blur of panic and determination. The woman's soft sobs were all I could hear, echoing in my head. Every instinct screamed at me to turn and run, to get as far away from this nightmare as possible. But I knew if I left, that woman wouldn't survive the night. I couldn't afford to make a mistake. Not out here, in the middle of nowhere. Peering around the corner of the cabin, I watched the man through the window. He moved slowly, like he was in control, like he knew no one would be coming. His sheer size was intimidating, and his slow, deliberate movements filled me with dread. If I tried to overpower him, I wouldn't stand a chance. But what other option did I have? The more I thought, the more it became clear. I had to outsmart him. Years of exploring had taught me how to move quietly, how to blend into the shadows, how to use the environment to my advantage. The cabin's rickety generator, sputtering away in the corner of the yard, gave me an idea. If I could cut the power, I might have a window of opportunity. I crept toward the generator, keeping low and sticking to the tree line. The smell of gasoline filled the air as I approached the rusted machine. The man was still inside, unaware, and the woman's sobs had grown quieter, like she was losing hope. I found the power cord and yanked it free. The generator sputtered and died, plunging the cabin into darkness. For a second, everything was silent, too silent. My heart thudded in my chest as I listened, waiting for the man's reaction. Then I heard him curse, his heavy footsteps thudding inside the cabin as he stumbled in the sudden blackness. He was distracted, just as I hoped. This was my chance. I darted toward the back door, keeping low and quiet. My hand hovered over the doorknob, trembling. If I got inside, there was no turning back. One wrong move, and we were both dead. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. The door creaked open, and I slipped inside, swallowed by the darkness. Inside, the cabin was even more oppressive. The air was thick with the smell of damp wood and sweat. The man was fumbling around near the generator, muttering angrily to himself, but I couldn't focus on him. I had to get to her. I crept across the floor, moving as silently as I could. She was right where I'd seen her, still bound to the chair, her eyes wide with panic when she saw me. I pressed a finger to my lips, trying to reassure her, though my own heart was racing uncontrollably. With shaky hands, I pulled out my pocket knife and began sawing through the rope binding her wrists. Every second felt like an hour, every tiny sound making my nerves flare up. The man was still distracted, but I didn't know how much longer I had before he realized something was wrong. Finally, I freed her wrists, and her hands dropped limply into her lap. I motioned for her to stay quiet as I started on her legs, but then came the sound I dreaded, the man's footsteps. He was coming back. We had to move, now. The second the ropes fell from her ankles, I grabbed her arm and pulled her to her feet. Her legs buckled, weak from being tied up for who knows how long. I could feel her trembling as I whispered, "We have to move. Stay low and follow me." Her wide, terrified eyes darted toward the door where the heavy footsteps were growing louder. The man was back. We moved quickly, but every step felt agonizingly slow, the floor creaking beneath us. My heart raced, and I couldn't help but imagine him turning the corner and spotting us at any moment. The darkness was our only ally, but the cabin was small, and it wouldn't take him long to realize something was wrong. I guided her toward the back door, holding my breath as the footsteps thudded closer. We had barely made it halfway when I heard the unmistakable sound of the man cursing again. He'd figured it out. He knew something was wrong. We were running out of time. The door was just a few feet away. I squeezed her hand, signaling for her to hurry. But then, in the dim light, I saw his shadow appear at the entrance to the hallway. A massive silhouette loomed just behind us, and for a brief, stomach-dropping moment, I was sure we were done for. I yanked open the back door, the old hinges creaking in protest, and we slipped into the cold night air. I could hear him shout, a guttural, enraged sound that made my blood run cold. He knew we were gone. "Run!" I hissed, pulling her into the forest. We darted into the trees, the thick foliage swallowing us up, but the sound of his heavy footsteps crashing behind us told me he wasn't far behind. I felt her stumble, her breathing ragged, but I pulled her up, refusing to slow down. We couldn't stop, not here, not with him so close. Branches scratched at my face, and roots threatened to trip us with every step. The forest was dense, and in the darkness, it was impossible to tell which direction would lead us to safety. But I didn't care. All I could think about was getting as much distance between us and that cabin as possible. The woman, she still hadn't spoken, was struggling to keep up, and I could feel her strength fading. Her breath came in short, panicked gasps. We couldn't outrun him for long, not like this. I glanced back, and for a brief second, I saw him. He was coming, a hulking shape barreling through the trees, getting closer with every step. My pulse quickened. We wouldn't make it if we kept running blindly. We needed to hide. My eyes scanned the area desperately, looking for any kind of cover. Then I saw it, a thick cluster of bushes at the base of a large tree, hidden from the trail. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. I grabbed her arm again, dragging her toward the bushes. We dove into the thicket, curling ourselves into the underbrush, trying to make ourselves as small as possible. I held my breath, pressing my back against the rough bark of the tree as the sound of his pursuit grew closer. The footsteps slowed, his heavy breathing filling the night air. I could hear him just on the other side of the bushes, so close I could almost smell the sweat and rage radiating off him. My heart pounded so loudly in my chest I was sure he could hear it. I squeezed her hand, praying we'd go unnoticed. For what felt like an eternity, he stood there, his dark silhouette barely visible through the leaves. He scanned the forest, muttering under his breath, his frustration building. I held my breath, willing him to move on. The woman beside me was shaking uncontrollably, her breath so shallow it was almost a wheeze. Then, without warning, he turned and stomped off in the other direction. I didn't dare move, didn't even exhale, until the sound of his footsteps finally faded into the distance. For now, we were safe. But I knew it was only a matter of time before he'd be back, and when he did, we had to be long gone. I turned to her, my voice low but urgent. "We need to keep moving. We can't stay here." Her eyes met mine, still filled with fear, but she nodded. We didn't have a choice. The night was alive with the sounds of the forest, the rustle of leaves, the chirp of insects, and the distant call of an owl. But all I could focus on was the pounding of my own heart and the ragged breaths of the woman beside me. Her strength was fading fast, and I could feel her trembling with every step. We had to keep moving. Every second we stayed in one place made us easier targets for the man hunting us. I led her through the dense underbrush, my mind racing. The forest was a maze of trees and shadows, and the moonlight filtering through the canopy did little to illuminate our path. Every snap of a twig or rustle in the bushes sent my pulse skyrocketing. It was impossible to know if it was just the forest settling or if it was the captor closing in on us. I glanced over my shoulder, straining to hear any signs of pursuit. The forest was eerily quiet, but I knew better than to let my guard down. The man was relentless, and I could feel the weight of his rage even if I couldn't see him. "Stay close," I murmured to the woman, pulling her along as gently but quickly as I could. "We have to keep moving. Can you run a bit faster?" She nodded, though her movements were sluggish and pained. Her injuries were taking their toll, and I could see the strain on her face. I had to find a way to get us both out of this alive. Suddenly, the woman gasped, clutching her side. I stopped and turned to her, worry etched on my face. "What's wrong?" "Leg," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I can't." Before she could finish, a harsh guttural sound broke the silence. The captor's roar of frustration. The noise was closer now, too close. I grabbed her arm and pulled her back onto her feet. We had to push through the pain. "Come on," I urged. "Just a little further." We moved again, but the forest seemed to close in on us, the trees pressing in like the walls of a prison. My mind was a whirlwind of strategies and fears. I needed to find a safe place to regroup, but the dense woods made it impossible to see any clear paths. A sharp, sudden crack echoed behind us. I whipped around, heart leaping into my throat. The captor was gaining ground, and the sound of his footsteps was unmistakable. We had to keep going, but my concern for the woman's condition was growing. She was slowing down, and every moment we delayed risked our lives. Desperation led me to an old, half-collapsed tree trunk. It was partially hidden by ferns and dense foliage, and though it wasn't much, it might offer temporary cover. I gestured for her to follow me, and we crawled behind the trunk, pressing our bodies against the earth. I peered out through the foliage, watching as the captor's shadow grew closer. He was moving methodically, like he was tracking us rather than just stumbling through the forest. My mind raced as I tried to think of a plan. The woman's breathing was shallow, her face pale. "Are you okay?" I whispered, though I already knew the answer. She nodded weakly, but her eyes were filled with pain. "Just tired." I had to buy us some time. I pulled out a small, old flare from my pack, a tool I rarely used, but had always carried as a backup. I ignited it, the bright light cutting through the darkness and casting long, eerie shadows. The captor's footsteps stopped abruptly, and I could hear him curse loudly. The flare was a desperate measure, but it might just be enough to divert him temporarily. The bright light illuminated the trees and the forest floor, and I watched through the crack in the foliage as the captor turned toward the flare. His figure was obscured by the flare's brilliance, but I could see him moving in the direction of the light. With the captor distracted, I took a deep breath and turned back to the woman. "We have to move now," I said urgently. "While he's distracted. We'll find a safer place soon, I promise." She nodded, and together we crawled out from behind the tree trunk and continued our escape. The forest was our ally and enemy, concealing and challenging us at every turn. I had to stay one step ahead or the captor would catch up, and this nightmare would end in the worst possible way. Every step we took felt like a battle, but we pressed on, driven by the hope of finding safety before it was too late. The forest was our refuge, but it was also our battleground. I led the woman through the thick undergrowth, every step guided by the desperate hope that we would soon find a way out. The flare's glow had given us a temporary reprieve, but the captor was relentless and would eventually return to the search. We finally reached a small clearing, an area of slightly open space surrounded by dense trees. I quickly scanned the area, looking for any sign of safety or potential hiding spots. Exhaustion was taking its toll on both of us, and the woman's limping gait showed just how much she was struggling. But we couldn't stop, not now. I found a small, shallow ditch partially hidden by ferns and underbrush. It wasn't perfect, but it was the best cover we had. "Get in," I urged, guiding her into the ditch and helping her settle in. I climbed in beside her, trying to make us as inconspicuous as possible. From our makeshift hideout, I could see the shadows shifting as the captor approached the clearing. His footsteps were heavy and methodical, each step a reminder of the danger closing in on us. I held my breath, straining to hear any sign of his movements. The captor was getting closer, and I could see his silhouette moving against the backdrop of the forest. He was angry, his movements sharp and jerky, and I could hear him muttering to himself, cursing our escape. His frustration was palpable, and I knew he was determined to find us. Minutes felt like hours as we lay hidden, our breaths shallow and controlled. The woman's fear was almost tangible, and I could see her shivering despite the warm night air. I tried to reassure her with a whispered promise. "We'll get through this. Just stay quiet." The captor stopped at the edge of the clearing, his shadow falling over us. My pulse raced as he scanned the area with a flashlight. The beam of light swept across the clearing, inching closer to our hiding spot. I could see the beam through the ferns, and I knew if it hit us, we'd be exposed. The flashlight beam moved closer, and I could hear him mumbling angrily. "Where did you go?" he growled. "Come out and face me." As the beam passed over us, I could feel the tension in my body. Every second felt like an eternity. The woman's hand was gripping mine tightly, her fear almost overwhelming. I focused on keeping as still as possible, praying that the darkness would protect us. Just when it seemed like the light would reveal us, the captor's attention was drawn away by a distant noise. It was a faint rustling, but it was enough to make him turn his head. He growled in frustration, stomping away from the clearing, leaving us in tense silence. As he moved off in the direction of the noise, I could finally let out the breath I'd been holding. But there was no time to relax. We had to keep moving before he realized the distraction was a ruse. I helped the woman out of the ditch, supporting her as we continued through the forest. The trees seemed to close in around us, and every sound made my heart skip a beat. I led us through a series of winding paths, trying to create as much distance as possible. The captor's angry shouts grew fainter, but I knew he wouldn't give up easily. We finally reached a narrow stream, its babbling water offering a brief respite from the tension. I stopped for a moment, allowing us to catch our breath. The woman was visibly exhausted, but she nodded when I told her we had to keep going. We had to find a way to contact the authorities or reach a place where we could finally be safe. As we continued along the stream, the first light of dawn began to break through the trees. The forest was still and quiet, but the danger was far from over. The captor could still be out there, searching for us, and I had to remain vigilant. With the rising sun came hope, but also the knowledge that the ordeal was not yet over. We needed to find our way out of the forest and into safety, and I had to make sure that no matter what happened, we'd survive this nightmare together. When we first moved to Green Hills, it was everything we'd hoped for. The neighborhood looked like it was straight out of a magazine. Perfectly kept lawns, neat houses, and kids playing outside without a care. It felt like the kind of place where you could really settle down and feel safe. From the start, everyone was super friendly. Neighbors waved as we unpacked, introduced themselves, and even brought over welcome baskets with cookies and little gifts. It was a nice touch and made us feel like we were part of a community right away. One of the first people to greet us was Peter, the guy next door. He was in his late 40s, always had a smile on his face, and seemed genuinely eager to help. He offered to help us with moving in, brought over some homemade cookies, and even volunteered to watch Noah if I ever needed a break. At first, everything seemed great. Noah was excited about his new school, and I was starting to make friends with other parents. Peter was always around, but in a helpful way. He offered to mow the lawn, fix a leaky faucet, and generally made himself available if we needed anything. Everything felt like it was falling into place. It was supposed to be a fresh start for us, and Green Hills seemed like the perfect place for that. But looking back, I should have noticed the little things that felt off about Peter. At the time, though, it just seemed like he was a nice guy who wanted to help out. As weeks went by, I started feeling something was off about Peter. It wasn't anything major at first, just little things that bugged me. I'd catch him watching me from his window, It was like he was always there, keeping an eye on us. I tried to shake it off as me being paranoid, but it didn't sit right. One evening, I came home to find the living room a bit different. A picture frame was moved, and a few other things were out of place. I told myself it was just me being forgetful. But then there were these strange noises at night. It was like someone was shuffling around outside or in the attic, but when I'd check, there'd be nothing there. Then, things took a creepier turn. I started getting these weird notes slipped under the door. They were vague and threatening, warning me to leave. They didn't have a signature or anything, just creepy scribbles. I tried to ignore them, thinking it was just some prank or a sick joke. Peter's behavior didn't help. He'd pop up unexpectedly, always with some excuse like needing to borrow sugar or wanting to chat. He seemed to know details about my life, stuff I'd never mentioned. It felt like he was intruding on my privacy, but I couldn't pinpoint why. I tried to rationalize it, thinking maybe I was just adjusting to the new place and overreacting, but the uneasy feeling wouldn't go away. It was like I was being watched, and the sense that something was seriously wrong kept growing. It all came to a head one night when I was home alone. Noah was at a sleepover, and I was trying to unwind after a long day. That's when I heard it, a faint, unsettling sound of footsteps coming from inside the house. My heart raced as I went to check, but I didn't find anything out of the ordinary. Later that night, I noticed something even more disturbing. The locks on the doors had been tampered with. They weren't broken, but they didn't feel right, like someone had tried to get in. I was freaked out, but I tried to calm myself down, thinking it was just a glitch or my imagination. Then I found it, a hidden passage in the basement. It was behind a false wall, and when I opened it, it led straight to Peter's house. My stomach dropped. I couldn't believe it. All the times I thought I was just being paranoid, he had actually been spying on us. That discovery was horrifying. I saw the passageway for what it was, a direct line between our homes. Peter had been watching us, listening to our conversations, and probably even tracking our movements. It was like my worst fears were true, and there was concrete evidence of his intrusion. The more I looked into it, the more unsettling things I found. I started finding surveillance equipment hidden in various spots around the house. It was like Peter had turned our home into his personal watchtower. And the worst part? The feeling that I was never really alone, that someone had been right there with me all along. After discovering the hidden passage and realizing Peter had been spying on us, I knew I had to do something. I called the police, but without solid evidence, they couldn't take immediate action. That's when I decided to hire a private investigator, Sam, to dig into Peter's background. Sam started looking into Peter's history, and what he found was chilling. Peter had a disturbing track record. There were reports of him stalking other people in previous neighborhoods, and there were even rumors about people who had gone missing. It seemed like every place he'd lived before had someone who disappeared under suspicious circumstances. We decided to get more concrete evidence. Sam and I began to gather everything we could, photographs of the surveillance equipment, recordings from the cameras, and any notes or strange messages Peter had left. It was a painstaking process, but we needed to build a case that would convince the authorities to act. One of the most unsettling discoveries was a hidden room in Peter's basement. It was filled with creepy memorabilia, old photographs of his previous victims, detailed maps of the neighborhood, and even a journal where he detailed his obsessions and plans. It was like a dark, twisted trophy room. With this evidence in hand, we worked on getting a search warrant. The more we uncovered, the clearer it became that Peter was a dangerous predator with a pattern of behavior that matched the threats he'd made against me. Even as we gathered proof, Peter's behavior grew more erratic. He started breaking into my house when I wasn't there, leaving behind increasingly aggressive messages. It was clear he knew we were onto him, and his desperation made him even more dangerous. The investigation was exhausting and terrifying, but we had to see it through. Every new piece of evidence brought a mix of relief and dread, knowing that the full extent of Peter's actions was more horrifying than I'd imagined. Once we had enough evidence, the next step was to catch Peter red-handed. Sam and I set up a plan with the local authorities to trap him in the act. We knew it was risky, but it was the only way to ensure he'd be stopped for good. The plan was to bait Peter into making a move. We staged a situation where it looked like I was away from the house for an extended period, just enough time for Peter to slip in and attempt something. We set up hidden cameras and left a few telltale signs that would trigger his paranoia. The night of the sting, my heart was pounding as I waited with Sam and a few officers in a surveillance van parked down the street. We monitored the feed from the cameras and watched as Peter, predictably, made his move. He approached the house with an eerie calmness, knowing he was about to invade our space once again. Inside, Peter didn't waste any time. He began tampering with the locks, just like he'd done before. But this time, we were ready. As he made his way inside, officers moved in quietly, surrounding the house to ensure he couldn't escape. The confrontation was intense. When Peter realized he was caught, his facade of normalcy shattered. He tried to flee, but was quickly apprehended by the authorities. They found him with a bag full of equipment and disturbing notes he'd written. The hidden room in his basement, full of the evidence we'd discovered earlier, was exposed for all to see. It was a moment of grim satisfaction and relief. Peter was arrested on multiple charges, including stalking, burglary, and making threats. The evidence we had gathered was overwhelming, and it was clear he would face serious consequences for his actions. Despite the arrest, the psychological impact on me and Noah was profound. The sense of violation, knowing someone had been watching and intruding on our lives, left deep scars. The relief of having Peter behind bars didn't erase the fear and anxiety we'd endured. As we tried to move forward and rebuild our sense of safety, the memories of Peter's obsession and the terror of those months lingered. The final confrontation had brought justice, but the emotional toll remained. A constant reminder of how close we had come to something even more terrifying. It was one of those nights where you couldn't see a thing. My car had broken down on this remote highway, and it was so dark you couldn't even make out the road ahead. There was no moon, and the clouds were thick, making everything seem like a black hole. The rain was coming down hard, drenching me through and through, and the wind was gusting so violently it felt like the car might lift off the ground. I was stuck in the middle of nowhere, with no signal on my phone and no sign of help. The only thing I could do was wait and hope that someone would drive by. I was freezing, and my clothes were soaked. After what felt like an eternity of standing in the storm, shivering and staring into the pitch-black void, I spotted a faint glow of headlights in the distance. As the car got closer, I could see it was an old sedan, battered and run down, but it was a vehicle, and that was all that mattered. It pulled up next to me, and the driver's side window rolled down. The driver was a woman with a calm, almost unsettling smile. She looked at me with this peculiar, steady gaze, and I couldn't quite place why it made me uneasy. At that moment, I didn't have many options. I was desperate to get out of the storm and away from this desolate stretch of road. I hesitated for a second, but with no other choices, I climbed into the car, hoping that this ride would take me somewhere safer. Little did I know, this decision was going to lead me into a whole new kind of trouble. As soon as I got into the car, I noticed a stark contrast between the storm outside and the warmth inside. The heater was cranked up, and the interior was cozy, almost too inviting given the situation. I tried to make conversation with the driver to ease the tension and figure out where we were headed. I asked her where she was going, and she responded with this vague, almost cryptic answer about just driving around and picking people up. Her voice was calm, but there was something off about it. I tried to chat about ordinary stuff, asking if she knew the area, if there was a town nearby, but every answer she gave was evasive. It felt like she was avoiding specifics. The car ride was eerily quiet, except for the occasional sound of the rain pelting against the windows and the faint hum of the engine. Every now and then, the driver would glance at me through the rearview mirror, and it was unsettling. It wasn't just a casual glance. It was like she was studying me, scrutinizing my reactions. I attempted to lighten the mood by talking about my day and how I ended up stranded. The driver's responses were oddly reflective and seemed to hint at something deeper, but she never actually said anything direct. Her answers were riddled with strange, philosophical remarks about fate and chance, which just made me feel more on edge. The road outside seemed to be twisting and turning in ways that didn't make sense. I couldn't get a sense of direction, and familiar landmarks seemed to disappear or shift. I started to feel a gnawing unease, wondering if we were even going in the right direction, or if this was all part of something more sinister. The whispers I heard earlier were getting louder and more distinct, like they were coming from inside the car. It was disorienting, and the combination of the driver's odd behavior and the eerie atmosphere made me increasingly anxious. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong, but I didn't have any way to escape or find out what was really going on. As we continued down the road, things started getting really strange. The more we drove, the more the outside world seemed to shift and warp. At first, it was just minor things. Roads that seemed familiar suddenly looked different, and street signs seemed to flicker in and out of view. But it quickly escalated. The sky outside was no longer just dark. It was like it was twisting and turning, almost like it was alive. The clouds moved in unnatural patterns, and it felt like the car was driving through a surreal, distorted version of reality. The landmarks I thought I recognized started to blur together, and the road appeared to loop back on itself. It was as if we were caught in some kind of endless, looping nightmare. Inside the car, the atmosphere became increasingly oppressive. The driver remained calm and eerily composed, her eyes still darting to the rearview mirror with that unsettling intensity. The whispers, which had been faint, were now clearly audible. They seemed to come from the car's speakers, but the source was never visible. The whispers were incoherent, but had a menacing tone that made my skin crawl. Every so often, the driver would make these cryptic comments that seemed to reflect on the absurdity of our situation, but never gave me any real answers. It was like she was commenting on the bizarre nature of the journey, rather than trying to reassure me. Her calm demeanor only added to the mounting dread. The sense of disorientation grew stronger. I began to doubt whether we were even moving in the right direction. The road appeared to be stretching and contracting, and the horizon seemed to shift as if we were driving through a hall of mirrors. I couldn't tell if the road was getting longer or if we were just going around in circles. Panic started to set in. I realized that if the car kept going like this, I might never get out. The reality I knew was slipping away, replaced by this unnerving, warped version. I desperately tried to find a way to break through this distorted world, but the more I struggled, the more it felt like I was trapped in a never-ending loop of confusion and fear. As we continued driving through the ever-shifting landscape, I started to notice something terrifying. The headlights from the car revealed a series of old, abandoned houses that seemed to have appeared out of nowhere. These weren't the quaint, dilapidated homes you might find in a ghost town. They looked menacing and foreboding, like something straight out of a nightmare. The driver slowed down as we approached a particularly imposing structure, an enormous, isolated mansion that loomed in the distance. The mansion was dark and shrouded in shadows, its windows like empty, soulless eyes staring back at us. It was clear that this wasn't just any old house. It was a place that radiated a sense of dread and malevolence. My heart pounded in my chest as the car made its way up the long, winding driveway. The mansion seemed to grow larger and more intimidating with every passing second. I glanced over at the driver, who was now smiling with an unsettling calmness, as if she were welcoming me to a destination she'd been anticipating. When we finally came to a stop, I saw that the mansion had a grand entrance, but it was overgrown with weeds and looked like it hadn't been touched in years. The air outside was thick with an eerie silence, broken only by the sound of the rain still pouring down. It hit me then, this wasn't a simple ride. This was a carefully orchestrated trap. The driver's odd behavior, the distorted road, and now this dreadful mansion all pointed to a sinister plan. I felt a wave of cold fear wash over me as I realized that the mansion might be the final destination of this nightmarish journey, and it wasn't going to end well. Desperation set in. I knew I had to find a way to escape before it was too late. I quickly started to think of possible escape routes or ways to get help. The mansion loomed ahead, an ominous testament to the horrifying reality that I had walked straight into a carefully laid trap. The car's engine rumbled ominously as the driver prepared to make a move, and I braced myself for whatever was coming next, knowing that I had to act quickly to avoid whatever fate awaited me inside that sinister house. As the car came to a halt in front of the mansion, I knew I was running out of time. The driver's unsettling smile was fixed in place, and the mansion ahead seemed to swallow up the last of the daylight. I had to get out of there, and fast. I took a deep breath and bolted from the car, heading straight for the mansion's front door. The rain was coming down harder, drenching me instantly, but I barely felt it as I ran. The mansion's grand entrance loomed before me, its old wooden doors creaking ominously as I pushed them open. Inside, the mansion was even more disorienting. The air was cold and stale, and the darkness seemed to press in from all sides. I sprinted through the large, shadowy rooms, trying to find a way out, or at least some sign of help. Every step felt like it echoed in the oppressive silence. As I moved through the dimly lit hallways, I heard footsteps behind me, slow, methodical, and getting closer. The driver had followed me in, and I could almost feel her presence closing in. I had to find a way to evade her. My heart raced as I searched for a place to hide or any means of escape. I spotted a staircase leading to the basement and took it, hoping it would offer a way out. The stairs creaked under my weight as I descended, my breath coming in short, sharp bursts. In the basement, the air was even colder, and the only light came from a small, grimy window near the ceiling. I hurried towards the window, pushing aside old furniture and debris. The driver's footsteps were now just outside the basement door, and her voice, eerily calm, called out my name. It sent a chill down my spine, knowing she was so close. With a surge of adrenaline, I managed to pry open the window. The gap was narrow, but I forced myself through, scraping my arms and legs as I did. I tumbled out onto the wet ground, rain pouring down in torrents. I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the pain, and raced toward the road. The rain was relentless, making it hard to see anything, but I kept running. I looked back and saw the mansion in the distance, the driver's silhouette still framed in the window, watching me. I could feel her gaze even from afar, and it fueled my desperation. I finally reached the highway, where a passing car stopped to help me. I climbed in, shivering and drenched, and the driver of the car quickly called the police. As I waited for them to arrive, I could still see the mansion's dark silhouette against the stormy sky. The driver's unsettling smile was etched into my memory, and I knew that the nightmare wasn't over until I was safely away from that place. The police arrived soon after, and I gave them a full report. As I left the scene, I felt a mix of relief and lingering dread. I had escaped, but the terror of that night and the image of the mansion's cold, empty windows would stay with me forever. It was a late summer night, and I was driving down this long, empty highway, heading to visit a friend in a neighboring town. The gas gauge was almost on empty, and I was starting to freak out a bit. Just when I thought I was going to be stranded, I saw this flickering neon sign for a gas station up ahead. Thank God, right? So I pulled in. The place looked like it was stuck in the past, all run down and creepy. It stood there all by itself, surrounded by nothing but empty fields and some trees way off in the distance. I got out of the car, and the old gas pump made this creaking sound as I grabbed the nozzle. The lights above were buzzing and flickering, making everything feel even more eerie. As I started to fill the tank, I realized how dead quiet it was. Too quiet. No cars passing by, no crickets, nothing. Just as I was thinking that, this skinny guy with hollow eyes appeared out of nowhere. He looked like he hadn't seen sunlight in years. He asked if I needed help, and even though he was polite, there was something about him that just felt off, like he was trying too hard to seem normal. I went inside to pay, and the station was just as creepy inside as it was outside. Dim lights, everything covered in dust, and that old, musty smell. While I was at the counter, I noticed a bulletin board covered in missing person flyers. Dozens of them. The faces stared back at me, their eyes filled with silent pleas for help. The guy behind the counter caught me looking and gave me this weird, cryptic smile. "People often get lost out here," he said. A chill ran down my spine. Back in my car, I tried to start the engine, but it wouldn't turn over. I checked my phone, no signal. Panic started to set in. The attendant walked over, his smile widening as he offered to help. He suggested I wait in the station's small, dingy office while he looked at the car. As I sat there, strange noises started coming from the back of the station. Whispers, footsteps, and a faint mechanical hum. My nerves were on edge. Sitting in that small, dingy room, my unease only grew. The silence of the gas station was broken by strange noises coming from the back. Whispers, footsteps, and a faint mechanical hum. Each sound seemed to amplify my fear. What was happening here? I looked around, trying to find something to distract myself, but nothing helped. The room was filled with old, abandoned junk, covered in dust, and the smell of mold was overpowering. Time seemed to crawl. I decided I couldn't just sit there doing nothing. I got up and headed toward the door, leading to the back of the station, trying to listen more closely to those weird sounds. At first I hesitated, but curiosity and the need to understand what was going on pushed me forward. I opened the door slowly, trying not to make any noise. The hallway was dark and damp, with a flickering light at the far end. Each step I took echoed, increasing my discomfort. I followed the hallway until I found a door slightly ajar. I approached it cautiously and peeked inside. It was a storage room, filled with old boxes and rusty tools. And then I saw something that made my blood run cold. A corkboard covered with photos and personal items, similar to those of the missing people on the flyers I had seen in the store. My heart raced. I needed to get out of there, but it was clear something terrible was happening. I ran back to the small room, my mind racing. I couldn't trust the attendant. That much was obvious. I needed to come up with a plan. Every passing second heightened my anxiety. I was alone in that creepy gas station, not knowing what the attendant really wanted and with no help in sight. That's when I heard footsteps behind me. I froze, trying to stay calm, but my heart was pounding out of my chest. I turned around and saw the attendant standing in the doorway, that disturbing smile still on his face. "Everything all right here?" he asked, but now his voice had a menacing edge. I knew I had to get out of there immediately. After my unsettling discovery in the back room, I rushed back to my car, hoping to get out of that creepy place as quickly as possible. But when I turned the key in the ignition, the engine just sputtered and died. I tried again, but the car wouldn't start. Panic began to set in. I got out of the car, hoping to see if something was wrong with the battery, or if maybe I had run out of gas. The old pump was still there, but I hadn't heard any fuel flowing. The attendant had disappeared, leaving the station eerily quiet again. My phone still had no signal, and the thought of being stranded in the middle of nowhere, with a creepy attendant and no way to call for help, was terrifying. I started to pace around, trying to think of what to do next. I considered asking the attendant for help, but after what I'd seen, I was scared to go near him again. My mind raced through possibilities. Should I try to walk to the nearest town, even though it was miles away? Should I wait for the attendant to return, hoping he would help me fix the car? I glanced back at the station, the old neon sign flickering weakly. It seemed like everything was closing in on me. I started to feel like I was trapped, and the more I thought about it, the more desperate I became. I needed to get out of there, but with the car dead and my phone useless, I was stuck. The sound of the attendant's voice suddenly broke the silence. "Need any help?" he called out from somewhere behind me. I turned and saw him coming towards me, that unsettling smile back on his face. My heart raced again. I knew I had to be careful. Whatever was going on, I had to find a way to escape before it was too late. With the car still refusing to start and no signal on my phone, I knew I couldn't stay at the gas station much longer. I needed to figure out what was really happening. I decided to investigate the station further, hoping to find something that might help me understand the situation or give me a way out. I made my way back to the small office where I'd been waiting earlier. The attendant was still nowhere to be seen, which made me even more anxious. The dim lighting and oppressive silence were getting to me. I took a deep breath and decided to check out the back room again, where I had seen that disturbing bulletin board with the missing person flyers. Carefully, I crept down the hallway and pushed open the door to the back room. This time I was more determined and less afraid. The musty smell hit me again, but I forced myself to focus. I moved towards the corkboard and examined it more closely. Among the flyers, I noticed that some of the faces were familiar. They were people who had gone missing recently, according to news reports I'd seen. But what really sent shivers down my spine was what I found next. Underneath the bulletin board, there was a small, hidden door I hadn't noticed before. It was slightly ajar. My heart pounded as I pushed it open, revealing a steep staircase leading down into the darkness. With a mix of dread and determination, I grabbed my flashlight and descended the stairs. The basement was even more unsettling than the rest of the station. The air was thick and cold, and the walls were lined with shelves holding various personal items, clothing, jewelry, and photographs that looked like they had been taken from the missing people. In the center of the room was a workbench cluttered with strange tools and a wall covered in crude drawings and scribblings. The drawings depicted disturbing scenes, rituals, sacrifices, and bizarre symbols. It was clear that whoever was behind this had been planning something truly horrifying. I felt a wave of nausea as I took in the gruesome sight. I needed to get out of there and find help, but I knew I had to gather as much evidence as possible before leaving. I snapped a few photos of the drawings and the items on the shelves with my phone, hoping they would be useful if I managed to get away. Just as I was about to leave, I heard the basement door creak open. The attendant's voice echoed down the stairs. "I see you've been busy." My blood ran cold. I knew I had to act fast. If I didn't escape now, I might not get another chance. With the unsettling discoveries I had just made, the urgency to escape the gas station reached its peak. My heart was pounding as I darted back up the stairs, clutching the evidence I had gathered. I had to get to my car and leave before it was too late. When I reached the back room, I saw the attendant standing near my car, his eyes locked on me with a menacing glint. His unsettling grin had returned, and his posture was threatening. "Looks like you found some interesting things," he said, his voice dripping with malice. I knew I had to act quickly. I bolted for the office, trying to avoid any direct confrontation. My mind raced through my options. Should I make a run for it and try to find help, or should I confront the attendant and try to get him out of the way? As I reached the office, I saw that the attendant had already started to block the exits. He was methodically closing off the doors, his movements calm and deliberate. The realization hit me. I was trapped. I spotted a fire extinguisher in the corner of the room. It wasn't much, but it might give me a chance. I grabbed it and readied myself for whatever was coming. The attendant was closing in, and I could see the sinister determination in his eyes. With a burst of adrenaline, I swung the fire extinguisher at him, catching him off guard. He stumbled back, giving me a brief moment to make a run for it. I dashed out of the office and towards my car, praying that it would start. The engine roared to life, and I felt a glimmer of hope. As I reversed quickly, I saw the attendant sprinting after me, his anger evident. I didn't dare look back as I sped down the deserted highway, my heart still racing. My thoughts were a whirlwind of fear and relief. I managed to get away from the gas station, but the horrifying images and the sinister encounter would stay with me. I knew I had escaped, but the sense of dread lingered, reminding me that I had narrowly avoided a truly nightmarish fate. Moving into our new house felt like a dream come true. It was a charming little place in a quiet suburban neighborhood, exactly what we wanted. Mark and I were so excited to start our life together here. The neighbors were super friendly, coming over to introduce themselves and even bringing us baked goods. Everyone, that is, except Mr. Graham. Mr. Graham lived next door in an old, slightly creepy house. He was an older guy who always seemed to keep to himself. I'd see him occasionally, usually just a quick glimpse as he shuffled in and out of his house. He never made eye contact and seemed to avoid conversation. It was odd, but I figured he was just a private person. At first, I didn't think much of it. We were busy unpacking, setting up the house, and getting to know the neighborhood. It was peaceful, and everything seemed perfect. I thought we'd just have to give Mr. Graham some time to warm up to us. A couple of weeks in, I started noticing some strange things. Late at night, I'd hear noises coming from Mr. Graham's house. Thumping sounds, sometimes what seemed like muffled cries and whispering that made my skin crawl. I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just my imagination running wild in the new, unfamiliar surroundings. One day, while Mark was at work, I saw Mr. Graham dragging a large, heavy bag into his garage. It looked odd, but I told myself it was probably nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I mentioned it to Mark, but he was skeptical, telling me I was overthinking things. He was probably right, but I couldn't help but feel uneasy. As time went on, my curiosity about Mr. Graham only grew. His blackout curtains were always drawn, the shed in his backyard was padlocked, and he never seemed to have any visitors. The other neighbors dismissed my concerns, saying he'd always been a bit odd but was completely harmless. I tried to let it go, but deep down I felt something was very wrong. Then one evening I saw Mr. Graham leave his house unexpectedly. It was my chance. I decided to sneak into his backyard to see if I could find any clues. As I peered through the small window of the shed, my heart nearly stopped. Inside, I saw disturbing, makeshift tools and what looked like bloodstains. My gut feeling had been right all along. Panicked, I convinced Mark to help me investigate further. We knew we had to find more evidence before going to the police. Our peaceful, quaint neighborhood was suddenly filled with a sense of dread and urgency. Little did we know, the worst was yet to come. Not long after we settled into our new house, the honeymoon phase of living in our perfect neighborhood began to fade. It started with little things. Late at night, I'd hear these odd thumping noises coming from Mr. Graham's house. At first, I thought I was just hearing things, but it became hard to ignore. The noises were consistent, almost rhythmic, like someone dragging something heavy across the floor. One night, I woke up to what sounded like muffled cries. I nudged Mark awake, but he was convinced it was just the wind or maybe a TV left on. He always had a logical explanation, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Then there were the whispering sounds. It was faint, but I could swear it was there. I'd be sitting in our living room, trying to relax, and I'd hear this low, almost conspiratorial whispering coming from the direction of Mr. Graham's house. I'd go to the window, but the moment I got close, the whispers would stop. It was eerie and unsettling, like we were living next to some ghostly presence. Mr. Graham's behavior was equally strange. During the day, he rarely left his house. When he did, he was always curt and avoided eye contact. He'd scurry back inside with his groceries or whatever he was carrying, like he couldn't get back fast enough. I tried waving a few times, but he never acknowledged me. One evening, I saw something that sent chills down my spine. Mr. Graham was dragging a large, heavy bag into his garage. It was one of those moments where your mind immediately jumps to the worst possible conclusion. I wanted to believe it was just trash or something mundane, but the way he handled it, sneaking glances around like he was making sure no one was watching, set off alarm bells in my head. I decided to talk to some neighbors about it. Maybe they'd notice something too, or could at least reassure me that I was overreacting. But every time I brought it up, they dismissed my concerns. They all said the same thing. Mr. Graham was just a bit odd but harmless. He's been here forever, they'd say. Keeps to himself, but he's never caused any trouble. But the weirdness didn't stop. One night, I heard a loud crash coming from Mr. Graham's house. It was followed by more thumping and what sounded like furniture being moved. I stood by my window, staring into the dark, half expecting to see something or someone, but the night remained still and silent. Then came the blackout curtains. I'd never really paid attention to Mr. Graham's windows until I noticed they were always covered with thick, dark curtains. Day or night, they were never open. It was like he was trying to block out the world or keep something hidden inside. I also started noticing his backyard. There was a shed, padlocked and seemingly forgotten. I'd see him go there occasionally, always late at night. He'd disappear into the shed and emerge minutes later, locking it up tight before hurrying back inside. My imagination ran wild with what could be in there. Despite Mark's skepticism, I couldn't let it go. The noises, the behavior, the bag, the shed, everything pointed to something being very wrong. I knew I had to find out more, even if it meant stepping into danger. The fear gnawed at me, but my curiosity and concern outweighed it. I needed to know what Mr. Graham was hiding, and I wasn't going to stop until I found out. My curiosity about Mr. Graham was eating away at me, so I decided to dig a little deeper. First, I started paying even closer attention to his routine. I watched when he left the house, when he came back, and what he did in between. He had this pattern. He'd leave for a while, come back with supplies, and always head straight to that shed in his backyard. One afternoon, when Mr. Graham was out, I decided to take a closer look at his backyard. I walked along the fence, trying to find any way to peek inside. The padlocked shed was particularly intriguing. I noticed there was a small window at the top that wasn't completely covered. I stood on tiptoe and managed to get a glimpse inside. The view was limited, but I saw some kind of workbench with various tools scattered around. It didn't look like the kind of tools you'd use for ordinary projects. They seemed a bit too specialized. I also took note of the missing person flyers on the bulletin board in our neighborhood. I went back to the board and started looking more closely. Each flyer had a picture of someone who had disappeared in recent years. What really caught my eye was how some of the flyers had dates that lined up with Mr. Graham's more suspicious activities. It was like the timeline was matching up in a really disturbing way. To gather more concrete evidence, I decided to check out the local library. I combed through old newspapers and records, looking for any mention of Mr. Graham or any unsolved cases. There were a few articles about people disappearing in the area, but nothing concrete about him. However, I did find a piece about an unsolved case from several years ago where a neighbor's disappearance was linked to a similar pattern of behavior. Armed with these observations, I convinced Mark to help me. We planned to investigate the shed when we were sure Mr. Graham wouldn't be around. It was a risk, but I felt like we were getting closer to uncovering something important. The more I gathered, the more I realized that my initial suspicions might be more than just paranoia. When Mark and I finally decided to investigate Mr. Graham's shed, we waited until late at night, making sure he was out. We crept through the backyard and tried to pick the lock on the shed. After a few tense minutes, we managed to get it open and slipped inside. The inside of the shed was even more unsettling than I'd imagined. The air was thick with the smell of rust and decay. As our flashlights cut through the darkness, we saw a workbench cluttered with tools. Some looked like they were used for heavy-duty work, while others were more sinister and had an eerie, homemade quality. Our eyes quickly fell on a wall covered with photographs and newspaper clippings. They were all about missing people, faces I recognized from the flyers in the neighborhood. Each one was pinned up with little notes and red strings connecting them in a bizarre web. It was clear that Mr. Graham had been tracking these individuals. But that wasn't all. We found a corner of the shed with a series of personal items, jewelry, wallets, and clothes that didn't belong to Mr. Graham. They were arranged in a way that made my skin crawl, like he was keeping trophies from his victims. The worst part was a journal we found hidden under a loose floorboard. It was filled with detailed accounts of people's disappearances, written in a twisted, methodical manner. The entries described how Mr. Graham had lured his victims and what he did after. It was chilling to read about his techniques and the way he seemed to take pleasure in his actions. I wanted to get out of there as fast as possible, but just as we were about to leave, we heard a noise outside. Mr. Graham was back earlier than we'd expected. We quickly made a hasty exit through a back window, narrowly avoiding being caught. With our hearts pounding, we knew we had to get this information to the authorities immediately. But as we left the shed, the weight of what we'd uncovered hit us hard. We had proof of Mr. Graham's involvement in the disappearances, but we also realized just how dangerous he was. The horror of our discovery made it clear that we needed to act fast before he had a chance to do any more harm. After our horrifying discovery in the shed, Mark and I knew we had to act quickly. We called the police, but they said they couldn't do much without concrete evidence. So we decided to take matters into our own hands, hoping to catch Mr. Graham in the act and get undeniable proof. We waited until the next night, setting up a plan to catch him red-handed. Mark and I positioned ourselves near the shed with cameras and recorders, ready to document anything that happened. We kept an eye on Mr. Graham's house, hoping he wouldn't notice us. Around midnight, Mr. Graham left his house and headed towards the shed. We watched from a distance as he unlocked it and went inside. Mark and I moved quickly to get closer, but we stayed hidden, not wanting to alert him. As we peered through a crack in the shed's door, we saw Mr. Graham rummaging through the items inside. He was methodical, sorting through the personal belongings and rearranging them. The sight was almost as chilling as what we'd seen the night before. He seemed to be preparing for something, and his actions were unsettlingly calm. Just as he was about to lock up the shed, I saw my chance. I stepped out from behind cover and confronted him. I accused him of the disappearances, showing him the evidence we had, photographs, the journal, and the personal items. Mr. Graham's reaction was cold and calculated. He didn't deny anything. Instead, he seemed almost amused by our discovery. He started to approach us slowly, his expression shifting from calm to menacing. Mark and I backed away, trying to keep a safe distance while continuing to record everything. The confrontation was tense, and we had to be careful not to provoke him further. In the midst of the standoff, we managed to alert the police with a text, providing them with our exact location. We kept Mr. Graham engaged, trying to buy time for the authorities to arrive. He taunted us, revealing just how twisted his mind was and how he took pleasure in the fear he created. When the police finally arrived, they took Mr. Graham into custody. The look on his face was one of bitter satisfaction, as if he knew he'd been outsmarted but was still reveling in the chaos he'd caused. As he was led away, we felt a mix of relief and horror, knowing that our lives would never be the same after this ordeal. The shed was thoroughly investigated, and the evidence we had gathered was used to confirm Mr. Graham's crimes. The police were able to link him to the missing persons cases, and the community was shocked by the revelations. The nightmare was over, but the memories of what we had uncovered would haunt us for a long time. When I arrived at Emma Collins' apartment, the scene was unsettling. Her usually tidy home was in disarray. Furniture was overturned, a lamp lay shattered on the floor, and her phone was abandoned, screen cracked and face down. It was clear from the start that something violent had happened. Emma was missing, and her frantic family was clinging to hope that I would find her. Emma's family described her as a cautious and thoughtful person, so her disappearance was out of character. They told me she had been receiving threatening messages from an anonymous sender. These messages had been increasingly ominous, and Emma had confided in her friends that she felt like she was being followed. Her friends also noted she had been unusually anxious, often looking over her shoulder and avoiding public places. The apartment itself spoke volumes. There were signs of a struggle, items strewn about as if there had been a frantic confrontation. Emma's personal belongings, including her purse and keys, were left behind, adding to the mystery of her disappearance. It was as though she had been abruptly taken from her home. I promised Emma's family that I would do everything in my power to find their daughter and bring her home. But with each piece of evidence pointing in different directions, I couldn't shake the feeling that this case was far more complex than it initially seemed. The missing phone and the threatening messages were just the beginning. What had happened to Emma, and why did she leave her apartment in such a state? The security footage from a nearby convenience store showed Emma leaving her apartment late at night and speaking to a man outside. His appearance matched that of a local drifter who had been known to wander the area. I tracked him down and brought him in for questioning. His name was Jack, and his ragged clothes and erratic behavior fit the profile of someone who had spent a lot of time on the streets. Jack's alibi checked out. He was at a shelter miles away when Emma disappeared. His story was consistent, but something about him felt off. During our conversation, he spoke in riddles and warned me about watchers in the shadows and the things you can't see. His cryptic remarks and unsettling demeanor made me uneasy, but I couldn't link him directly to Emma's case. As I dug deeper into Jack's background, I discovered he had been in and out of trouble with the law and had a history of petty crimes, but nothing that seemed to connect him to Emma. Then I stumbled upon a troubling pattern. There were other cases of missing women in the area, all of whom had received similar anonymous threats. The connections between these cases and Jack's presence were tenuous at best, but the overlapping themes of threatening messages and disappearances were too significant to ignore. Jack's cryptic warnings about watchers and shadows seemed to point to a deeper, more sinister element in the case. Despite the lack of direct evidence linking him to Emma, I couldn't shake the feeling that he might be part of something larger, something I was only beginning to uncover. In the midst of the investigation, I returned to Emma's apartment and discovered her diary hidden beneath the bed. It was a battered, leather-bound book filled with her scrawled handwriting. I hoped it might provide some insight into her state of mind in the days leading up to her disappearance. The diary was unsettling. Emma's entries were filled with paranoia and fear. She wrote about feeling watched and hearing noises outside her apartment. Her words grew more frantic with each page. One entry described her growing anxiety and how she felt someone or something was always lurking just beyond her sight. The final entry was particularly haunting. Emma wrote about a recurring dream where a faceless figure stood at her door, waiting to be let in. The entry abruptly ended mid-sentence. "If something happens to me, check the..." The rest was smudged, leaving the last thought unfinished and chilling. I tried to piece together the names and situations mentioned in the diary with what I knew about Emma's acquaintances, but each person I spoke to seemed to avoid discussing her fears. They all claimed Emma had been increasingly isolated and detached, but their vague responses only deepened the mystery. The diary hinted at a deeper threat and suggested Emma had been on edge for a long time, but it didn't provide concrete answers. Instead, it opened up new questions about who or what she might have been afraid of. As I sifted through her words, I couldn't help but feel that Emma had been trying to communicate something crucial, something I was still struggling to understand. As the investigation progressed, I turned my focus to one of Emma's close friends, Sarah. She had been one of the few people Emma confided in about her fears. Sarah had always seemed supportive, but something about her behavior was now raising red flags. I began noticing inconsistencies in Sarah's statements. She was evasive when asked about Emma's recent activities and seemed unusually anxious whenever I pressed for details. The more I dug into Sarah's background, the more discrepancies I found, small lies and omissions that didn't add up. Then, Sarah disappeared. Her abrupt vanishing act was as mysterious as Emma's. She left behind a series of unsettling voicemails on my phone. The messages were distorted and barely audible, but one was clear enough to send shivers down my spine. "You were never supposed to find her." Sarah's disappearance added a new layer of complexity to the case. It was as if someone was orchestrating a game, and I was only seeing fragments of the truth. Was Sarah involved in Emma's disappearance, or was she a victim of the same sinister force? I had to unravel Sarah's connection to Emma's case and figure out why she had vanished and what her cryptic message really meant. In a last-ditch effort to find something concrete, I turned my attention to Emma's broken phone, which had been damaged during her disappearance. With the help of forensic experts, I managed to recover some of the data from the device. What I found was both eerie and cryptic. Among the recovered files was a voice memo, recorded by Emma just before her disappearance. In the memo, her voice was barely a whisper, trembling with fear. She spoke about hearing noises outside her apartment, the sound of footsteps growing louder each night. Then she mentioned something, or someone, she couldn't see but felt was watching her. The recording abruptly cut off, leaving the last part of her sentence unfinished. "If you find this, look for..." The fragment of the message left me with a haunting feeling. Emma had been trying to convey something important, but the recording didn't provide any clear answers. It was as if she had been on the verge of revealing a crucial detail before being interrupted. As I listened to the distorted message over and over, I felt the case slipping through my fingers. Every clue seemed to lead to another dead end. The recovered files, combined with the cryptic message, left me with more questions than answers. Just when I thought the investigation had reached an impasse, a new lead emerged, one that could potentially change the entire direction of the case. But what was this new clue, and how did it fit into the puzzle of Emma's disappearance?